So we're going to look at a History Through Objects Part 2 today. Your independent work is going to be to look at the Sutton Hoo artifacts in a Google Arts and Culture link. So yesterday I gave you a brief recap of hundreds, if not thousands of years of British history, and here's that story so far. So in the Bronze Age and into the Neolithic Age, you have settlements in England by the Druids and people known as the Britons, with an O, Britons. They have settlements for hundreds of years. They build things like Stonehenge, and they fight amongst themselves for resources and space and land. This continues through the next period. People build into small cities and develop trade routes both outside of Britain and within Britain. And then the Romans show up, and they take over fairly easily because there's not one big centralized government in the UK at this time. There's just all these small groups. But they end up having to fight the barbarians, the people who are not super keen on Rome taking over and imposing their own laws and cultures and religions and monetary systems. So they fight back and they build Hadrian's Wall. The Romans build Hadrian's Wall to keep those barbarians out of their territory. However, it doesn't work because people do rise up from within the territories, and Rome generally starts to weaken and pull their troops back closer to home. So throughout the early 300s CE, you have Rome pulling out of Britain and kind of leaving behind people who did consider themselves to be Roman Britons, but then also people who consider themselves to not be Roman Britons and have their own identity and culture. So we're going to look at some of those people groups today. All right, as we go through these, remember to jot down important notes. I'm looking for a couple of sentences or bullet points for each of them so you get the main points. Don't just take the first thing I say, take as much as you possibly can in quick bursts of words. All right, this is the Hinton St. Mary mosaic, and this was actually discovered, I believe, in the 60s, where someone was excavating in their basement or their garage, and they found this mural, this mosaic underneath several layers. Like, imagine digging under your house and discovering something like this. That's what happens when you live in a place that's been continually occupied for hundreds and thousands of years. So they found this mural, and at first they thought it was a much later period. They thought, well, this has to be from around 600 CE when Augustine, who was a saint, came in and brought Christianity to Britain. But as they looked closer, they realized, no, this is actually from the Roman period. So as Rome was sort of pulling out from the UK, you have people who are still living there in the style of Romans. So you have mosaics and art and bathhouses and all kinds of amazing structures. And the person who made this mosaic had it built in their house, probably just for decoration. You can see how intricate it is. If you look at the one over here, you can see all the little tiles that have been put together to make this larger image. And look how elaborate this is. There's lots of different scenes. It appears to be seasons as well. So you have scenes that are more like trees flowering, you have hunting, and then you also have images that show Roman mythology. So you have Bellerophon, I think, is in one of them, and different parts of Roman mythology. But then you have this figure in the center, which is really interesting, because this is probably supposed to be a representation of either Jesus Christ or the Emperor Constantine, who was the first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire, who officially legalized Christianity for everyone. Before that, Christians were persecuted tremendously. They were treated with great suspicion because their idea that there is one God, it was opposed to the Roman mythology and religion of the time, where there were lots of different gods. So what's interesting about this mosaic is you have those two things side by side, this Christian deity or the emperor who brought Christianity to all of Europe, and then Roman mythology at the same point. But what this shows us is that Christianity had come into Britain a lot earlier than people believed, 300 years earlier than people actually believed. So it shows that blending of cultures that happened so much through this period, where you have some elements of Christianity and some elements of Roman pagan religion. And you're going to see in Beowulf, too, that tension between the ideas of Christianity and the pagan religious practices and traditions that came with the settlers in Britain. Speaking of settlers, you have lots of different groups. So you have the Jutes and the Angles and the Saxons and the Franks. We refer to these kind of collectively as the Anglo-Saxons. Unfortunately, the Jutes and the Franks kind of get the short straw because there were fewer of them. So all of these people groups see that Rome has left and they start to come in. And there's two theories. One theory is they came in and they immediately conquered people and there were bloody battles and it was awful and there were tons of wars and fighting, and until finally the Anglos and Saxons sort of separated into kingdoms and lived relatively peacefully among themselves. A more modern theory, though, is that people just started coming to settle because there was open land and they were welcomed, and that there was fighting, there was lots of fighting, but it wasn't a full-scale war in the sense that we kind of thought of traditionally. So as these people groups come in, you can see on the map, they're coming in mostly from this side. The people who considered themselves Britons, so the people from even before the Roman Empire, are pushed out to the sides of the country. So they now separate into kingdoms, and this happens over several hundred years till finally there is one big unifying culture that comes in, and the Anglo-Saxon period really begins. And this is really where the legend of Arthur comes from, is there are Anglo-Saxon leaders who come in and are able to unify the whole country as one political entity. And the idea of King Arthur, the person who did this, actually comes from several historical figures, probably not named Arthur, one of them might have been, who were able to do the same thing and unify politically the country and fight against invaders coming in from Europe. Now, the Sutton Hoo artifacts comes from, basically there's a mound they found in, I believe, the 1930s, where they were digging and they found this whole hoard of treasure. And it was the burial place of a great warrior or king. Now, this is really similar to Beowulf, and you know that he's going to be buried in a mound with all of his treasure. I want you to think about that when you're thinking about the Sutton Hoo hoard. So hoard is a word that just means to pull a bunch of things in and keep them in one place. And so they found lots of very elaborate, interesting artifacts that you're going to look through in today's assignment. But this is one of them. Now the one over here is the actual burial mask that they found. So this would have been worn by the king or the warrior as they laid him to rest. So think about like Egyptian mummies and their sarcophagi. This is kind of the same idea. Now this side over here is a reconstruction of what it probably would have looked like when it was first made. I want you to notice the details. You have elaborate Celtic knotting. Celtic knotting comes from more of that ancient Briton and Druid and Irish tradition. So you're blending that alongside these scenes of warriors, and the Anglo-Saxons were warriors. You also have gold inlay with all this fine brushwork and design, the very fashionable mustache, and then gold plating all the way up over the top. So I want you to imagine working this metal by hand, pre-modern tools, and carving in all these intricate designs and how long that would have taken. So how much these people would have valued the person for whom they made this. You can see the metal is plated together with little rivets as well. Again, all of this pre-modern machinery, before engines existed, all of this was done by hand, over fire, elaborately over time. So this burial helmet is from roughly 625 CE. That's about when Beowulf should be taking place, roughly in that period. Now, you're going to look through some other objects. You get a choice as to what objects you use, and you are going to answer some questions for each of the 3 objects that you choose. What's the object? What do you think it was used for? What details do you notice? What is it made out of? So just like I went through in the Sutton Hoo burial helmet, what do you see? What do you notice? What details are there? What patterns? What does this tell you about how the person or people who owned it lived? And what does it tell you about the culture and what it valued? So you're going to answer those questions for each of the 3 objects that you choose. Your final task is to write a paragraph that makes inferences about what Anglo-Saxon life was like based on those objects. So you're looking at these sort of like a window into the world of the people who lived during this time. Be as specific as you can and give lots of detail about which parts of the objects informed your conclusions. So again, you're drawing evidence from all these different pieces that you're examining and bringing it together to say, here's what Anglo-Saxon life was like. So I'm looking for a really solid paragraph with lots of detail.